Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome back. This is our fourth and last session for this year's Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. We're so happy you could join us. Thank you, thank you. My name is Lindsay Boucher with Prairie Chapter, the Prairie Chapter Coordinator with Sierra Club Canada Foundation, and it's my pleasure to invite Dana Martin from the Battle River Indigenous Relations Council here with us today. So before we get started, I'd just like to take a moment and acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan. That includes Treaty Number 2, Treaty 4, Treaty 5, Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10. And Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, the Saulteaux, Nakota, Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and Denisovan people, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. So I'd just like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples who have lived and cared for this land for centuries, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion today and to learn more about the treaties themselves and the duty to consult in Saskatchewan. So as I mentioned, I'm Lindsay Boucher with the Sierra Club of Canada. We work on supporting initiatives across the Prairie provinces, and in Saskatchewan, our work has really revolved around water and wetland advocacy, both in Saskatchewan and also the interprovincial connections that exist there. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dana Martin. So Dana Martin is with the Battle River Indigenous Relations Council. She's the director there, and the Battle River IRC is a non-for-profit corporation established to assist Treaty 6 First Nations in the Battlefords region with Crown Consultations. And she's coming with us with her background in Indigenous law and municipal planning. And the presentation today will discuss the duty to consult and the environment. So just a few housekeeping notes before I pass it over to Dana. We'll keep, I think, the bulk of the questions we'll keep the bulk of the questions for the end of the presentation. If you do have a pressing question, you can raise your hand. And there's two options to ask a question. So you can type them in that chat box, the question box, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you at the end of the presentation. So with that, I think that's all for me. Dana, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dana Martin. I'm presenting to you today from Cutknife, Saskatchewan, my home office. And normally I work out of North Battleford with the Battle River IRC. So I'll get into a little bit more about our organization as the presentation goes on. But the Battle River IRC was established last summer to assist First Nations in the region with Crown Consultation. This presentation is obviously going to be focused a lot on the duty to consult. That necessarily involves a discussion of treaty, and I hope this presentation will be informative to you. And I've tried to aim it at an audience that might have different levels of familiarity with treaty and with the duty to consult. So as Lindsay mentioned, my background is in law. Before coming here and taking this job, I was practicing as a lawyer in Calgary, and I've left the law behind, and I wasn't terribly sorry to see it go, but that background really informs a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis with the Battle River IRC. So without further ado, this is a little overview of what we're going to cover today. So we'll talk a little bit about treaty. I'll explain a little bit of the background on the duty to consult and where it comes from. We'll talk about how the duty to consult looks in this province in Saskatchewan. The IRC model, so that's where we take our name from, and where it originated was Alberta oil sands. So you'll hear a little bit about that, about a project that we're working on right now, and after that an open discussion. So we really like to foreground all of our conversations with treaty because you know, I think that we often lose sight of the fact that these lands were originally stewarded since time immemorial by our treaty partners, First Nations, and by other Indigenous groups of Métis. So First Nations, when they entered into treaty about 150 years ago, were entering into an agreement where they thought they were agreeing to share the land, not sell it. So it wasn't a transaction or a deal. It was supposed to establish a long-term relationship. So coming to today, we have Canada and Saskatchewan, our treaty partners with First Nations today. And Saskatchewan has been looped in because the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement in 1930 transferred control of lands and resources to the provinces. So the province really does have a lead role to play in implementing treaty. Now the treaties, the number of treaties were established across the prairies. In Saskatchewan, we have a whole bunch of them, although I would say that 6 for our kind of front of mind for me, because I live in Treaty 6 territory, and the projects that we work on are primarily in Treaty 4 and 6 territory. Now, those treaties established rights and obligations on both sides, and the treaty agreement is, you know, just by virtue of being a treaty, it is a mutual affirmation of sovereignty. So it's 2 equal partners who are entering into this agreement. And First Nations generally regard this treaty as a sacred obligation. You know, when I think that a lot of trust was built up around this agreement because they had the opportunity to conduct pipe ceremonies and other ceremonies that made this agreement sacred. So this treaty was designed to last as long as the sun shines, the water flows, and the grass grows, and you can see those elements in the treaty medal on the left. Unfortunately, the treaties were breached almost as before the ink was dry, and you can see that in some of the claims that have come forward, and these are just being dealt with today. So one of them that you may have heard of is treaty land entitlement. So I would say almost half or around half of the First Nations in Saskatchewan alone didn't receive the land that they were entitled to under treaty. So, you know, in 1992, they entered into an agreement to try to provide the necessary funding to compensate First Nations and to allow them to purchase the land that they should have been entitled to under treaty, but there's still some frustrations with that process today. Another major breach of treaty was agricultural benefits. So under treaty, a certain amount of, for example, like cows, plows, farming implements, and instruction by farming instructors was promised under treaty. So those implements, very poor records were kept of their provision. They weren't provided in many cases, and fast forward to today, Treaty 8 has settled their agricultural benefits claims, but Treaties 4 and 6 are still working through those. So there's a number of other breaches that started occurring very early on in that treaty relationship. If you are interested in pursuing further, there's a whole slew of resources available to you, but these are some of the ones that I would suggest getting started with because they are pretty relevant to Saskatchewan. So the thing to know is that treaty rights isn't the only source. So, you know, inherent rights are another source of rights for First Nation that don't come from treaty. It's not because First Nations entered into an agreement with the British Crown that they have rights. Their rights predate those agreements and predate contact. And so that's been recognized since even before, you know, the Constitution recognized treaty and Aboriginal rights as far back as 1973 and Calder. And you know, we have to think, I think, of those Section 35 rights under the Constitution as much broader than just hunting, fishing, and gathering. It really has to do with all of the activities that surround and support those activities. And, you know, even things like being able to pass on those rights to other generations are also protected under the Constitution. So we hear a lot about the Crown duty to consult in the media because it always makes headlines when Indigenous groups are protesting, you know, whether the Crown adequately consulted with them on this or that natural resource project. But what is the duty to consult? So it's triggered anytime the government is making a decision that may impact those treaty or inherent rights that we talked about. So that could be a project-specific decision, like we want to put a SAGD plant here, or it could be strategic high-level decisions. So for example, on the Mackenzie gas pipeline, when they were designing the environmental review process. The duty to consult can be triggered on a wide range of decisions. And once that happens, it creates a legal obligation on Canada and the province. And the Crown is required to uphold its own honor. So the goal is reconciliation. And when we talk about reconciliation, what we're really saying is reconciling those pre-existing rights with the Crown's assertion of sovereignty over these lands and resources. So in 2004, the Supreme Court first recognized that the duty to consult applies. That was in the Haida case. And they established duty to consult as a procedural right. Now, that sounds extremely boring, just said that way, but I think what I'm trying to show here is that duty to consult gives rise to a process or a procedure or something approximating a relationship. So what it's really trying to do is for the court to say, listen, we're not going to tell you what the outcome has to be, but you have to have a dialogue. And a year later, the Supreme Court also recognized duty to consult as a mechanism for treaty implementation, and that was in a case called Mikisew Cree First Nation. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Mikisew Cree is located in northeastern Alberta in the heart of the oil sands. So the depth of consultation isn't the same all the time. It depends on a few things, whether you need to have a conversation or to share some information or give notice, or you need to do much deeper consultation, even getting close to you know, free, prior, and informed consent. So the depth of consultation is based on the strength of the claim, the scope of the right, and the seriousness of the impact. So this was, just bear in mind that this was also, this case law was also developed in a little bit of a different context in BC, but those are the basics of what we're looking at when we say, how involved should we be with, or how involved can we be with this decision? But we know that even low-level consultation has to be meaningful. So here's what happens when the rubber hits the road. The difficulties arise with administration of this complex, complicated procedure that the Supreme Court gave us. So the difficulty is that the Band Office doesn't have the mandate or the resources to implement consultation, and they're met by a number of barriers that we summarize as a lack of capacity. So the timelines are often very short. For example, even on a federal project, which is pretty enormous, we're looking at a 3-week timeline for response often to preliminary documents. It's expensive. You need to hire professionals, often legal counsel, and people with a lot of expertise. So we summarize those difficulties as a lack of capacity. And what happens is when Indigenous groups aren't able to meet those demands, the void gets filled by either government or industry. And what we find they often do is to deny or minimize those impacts, or to assume that they can predict what they will be, even though they don't necessarily have any site-specific evidence or traditional land use information on which to base their decision. So then what they end up doing is relying on a proximity analysis. Okay, well, we're putting this project in here. We have reserve land X distance away. We'll notify that First Nation. But that doesn't really reflect the reality of how treaty and inherent rights are practiced on the land. So what ends up happening is a notification letter sent by registered mail to the band office ends up becoming the full extent of consultation. And just because of the way the law works, I guess, silence is often interpreted as consent, when that isn't the case at all. Silence often means that there's no capacity to respond. It doesn't mean that somebody has considered the information and consented to it. So what ends up happening? Well, long story short, erosion of those treaty and inherent rights. We know, and the courts have told us that consultation is a two-way street, but it's not realistic to expect parties with absolutely no capacity to engage at the same level as the government or industry. And one last note here is that there isn't any ability to consult on past projects. So going back to my earlier slide, the Supreme Court pronounced on the duty to consult in 2004. There were hints of it earlier in, the 1990s, but development, the taking up of lands and the settlement of lands has been occurring since how many hundreds of years ago. And consultation hasn't been occurring, but we can't go back and say, hey, we want to talk about this dam that you built in, the 1950s or whatever. So turning to Saskatchewan, we refer often to the comments of Jim Sinclair at the close of the First Ministers' Conference in 1987, when the provinces, Canada, and First Nations and Métis weren't able to come to an agreement about what self-governance might look like in the Constitution. And Jim Sinclair had some very powerful words for the government of the day, and that was Premier Grant Devine. I think our question when we review his words is, what has changed? And I'm not sure that much has. I think that the attitude is still very similar today. So why do we take that perspective? Well, last year, Saskatchewan announced in its capital plan a new $120 million remand facility to be built. I think it was in Regina. And so without, commensurate services or supports or other plans for infrastructure, it seems like Saskatchewan's only focus or investment when it comes to, Indigenous people is basically janitor jobs or jail. We know that, this was announced shortly after incredibly high rates of Indigenous population in the jail system in Saskatchewan was recorded once again. So, what does that add up to? We've heard harvesters in the communities that we work with express fears about going onto private lands to exercise treaty rights, or even to ask for a phone call for a flat tire after the Gerald Stanley trial. And Saskatchewan responded with the Trespass to Property Act that they're still waiting to implement. In late 2020, Saskatchewan joined a couple of other provinces in opposing federal implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And those kinds of objections are often rooted in fears over a veto. So all of a sudden, Indigenous people are going to have the ability to, oppose whatever development they like. And this was one of the first time that some of our communities had been reached out to by the ministers in their time in leadership. So something that we see a lot in the media is ongoing conflict over the sales of Crown lands. So this goes back to that treaty land entitlement obligation that remains outstanding on the part of Saskatchewan and Canada. And this the province has a pretty strong policy for selling off Crown lands. So that raises a really big question, like, okay, well, what will be left for treaty implementation if we do that? And there's a number of other examples where we say, okay, you know, what are we seeing on the ground with respect to treaty implementation in the province? So just going back to my earlier slide about, you know, the Supreme Court giving us that direction that duty to consult is really a mechanism for treaty implementation, it becomes all the more important when we're working in a province that doesn't have any other framework to implement the treaties. And Saskatchewan has taken the position that since it wasn't a province at the time that the treaties were negotiated, you know, it doesn't really have a responsibility in respect to them. So that's just, you know, a challenge when it comes to recognition of treaty rights and consultation and natural resource development. So just so that you kind of have the full picture of the background, there is a policy in force with respect to consultation. It's been around since 2010 and hasn't been updated since that time, but it looks decent on paper. In practice, it does create some difficulties, and I've already covered some of those. So this is really just to let you know that there is kind of a policy out there that the province can rely on. The other thing that I kind of wanted to link this back to, just with, you know, with the idea in mind that much of the audience may be really interested in and familiar with environmental assessment, is, you know, the duty to consult does kind of run parallel to environmental assessment. It often gets subsumed into the EA process, but environmental effects are very different, and an EA process that only focuses on environmental effects won't necessarily fulfill the duty to consult, because treaty right impacts just can be different. You know, impacts to treaty and inherent rights can show up even if there aren't any significant environmental effects, and even without the project or the decision triggering environmental assessment. So that's just kind of a nuance that, you know, isn't always obvious when you're looking at it from the outside. So what the heck is an IRC, and what does an IRC do? Well, IRCs are, you know, or they're sometimes referred to as government industry relations, or lands and resources office, or consultation office. And they were established first in '97 by Fort McKay, also located in the middle of the oil sands, and established out of necessity because First Nations and government in the region were trying to figure out how to deal with the rapid pace of development, understanding that the landscape was going to be changed for decades, and, you know, maybe irreversibly, and so how are we going to you know, accommodate First Nations on that landscape and get the product out of the province. Mikisew Cree First Nation followed in 2001. Today they have a very robust consultation office. Cold Lake First Nation brought IRCs to Treaty 6 in 2014, and that's just showing that this is a model that can be reproduced in different treaty areas, because the duty to consult still needs to be filled no matter what treaty you're in. So in Alberta, you would see this office be funded by the province and by their work in impact benefit agreements. But that's not necessarily the case here. So in practice, the IRC is there to basically be the bureaucrat. We're the ones who have to answer the phones, read the mail, respond in writing, ask for a plan about how we're going to conduct consultation, and we have to ask for resources to do the work, because as I mentioned before, it is very resource intensive. And the other thing about the IRC is that really we can only work on the direction of leadership and the community. Just like any professional, we take instructions from our clients. And what we really work to do, I guess unlike a lot of other professionals, is build that internal capacity. So if you hire a lawyer, he's not going to necessarily teach you how to be one. You can't really become your own lawyer, I guess, at the end of that relationship. But that's something that we are really trying to do, is to work ourselves out of a job in a way so that the community will have that capacity to take up this work and take it forward on their own behalf. So something else that you may hear mention of is traditional land use, or TLU work. And this is really a staple of what we do, because going back to that duty to consult trigger, you're looking at impacts to rights. But how can you tell what the impacts are if you haven't, documented and explored those rights? So an important aspect of TLU studies is that they show the past, present, and even the future use of lands, because when you are looking at development, you do want to know what's coming and who or what could be impacted. So we see this as the starting point for conversations with government and industry. We recognize the value of having it vetted by legal, because it does disclose and define rights. And we also do recognize the importance and the sensitivity around some of this information, and maybe it should be, maybe ways to keep it confidential, or certain aspects of it that are sensitive. Maybe we need to think about how to protect that, and that's something that you would see in the new federal impact assessment legislation. So what do we do on a day-to-day basis? Lots of research, lots of writing, reporting to leadership in the community so that they can make informed decisions, negotiating agreements where possible, but we are emphatically not a decision maker, and that always remains with the community. So just a little bit about our history. We started hearing a little bit about nuclear power being on the horizon in Saskatchewan in late 2019. So I think that it got included in the 10-year growth plan, and there were also some murmurings about it from Natural Resources Canada as part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this being part of the clean energy solution to reducing emissions. So I think at that point, the chiefs decided that it was necessary to have some capacity to respond to those kinds of issues, and they allocated the resources, hired me last summer, and since then we've been engaged in a little bit of fact finding to understand how consultation's done in the province, and engagement where we can. This is a really interesting case that came out this summer, and I just want to share it with you. I'm not sure how much of the audience would be familiar with it. And it came out of northeastern BC, Treaty 8 area. And this was a test case on cumulative effects on treaty rights. So normally when a case is advanced about the duty to consult, it's really about one project and saying, hey, the government didn't fulfill its duty to dialogue with us about this project. We haven't been, accommodated, and the impacts haven't been mitigated in the way that we wanted, and we want an opportunity to start again on this consultation. But this Blueberry River case kind of turned that, I'll say, on its head, where they said the totality of the development has had an irrevocable impact. It has infringed our treaty rights as a whole. And it's not about any one particular project, it's about all of them. And Blueberry River First Nation is located in an area that has developed very rapidly in the past 50 years. And what they've seen happen is that, they're running out of places to practice their treaty and inherent rights. So they started building evidence and ended up having a trial that lasted 1.5 years on this topic. And they went through the regulatory scheme that the province had in place for everything: oil and gas and forestry, agriculture, policy by policy, and the court determined that the whole regulatory scheme had failed to protect their rights and protect them from cumulative effects. So BC announced that it wouldn't appeal this ruling, they started, they entered into talks as the court directed them to with Blueberry River, and there was a pretty significant initial settlement that came out earlier this fall. Basically, this case really sends the message that, listen, that relationship that was set up by treaty was intended to be a relationship, and it wasn't a license to take up lands. Absolutely. There's a balance there that needs to be struck, and that's the message that we're seeing from this case. So that's kind of what we're thinking about in a province where a lot of development has happened, and you know, what is left for Indigenous people to exercise their rights.
And Dana,
so that brings, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we just had a really quick question here specifically about that last slide there. Someone was just wondering if the Blueberry First Nation is in the same area as the Site C Dam.
Yeah, so one of the impacts is, you know, what are the implications for Site C? I don't think that has been determined yet. It's a really big question, but it's definitely something that people are raising in the analysis of this decision, and that's something that I've seen in the media, and I'm sure we'll see further commentary on that. So this is just an example of something that we are looking at and working on, and this is, you know, this project is kind of the reason why I've made the connect with Lindsay and some of the other members on this call is the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project, and just understanding what the, you know, environmental effects might be, first of all, and the impacts to treaty and inherent rights, second of all. So I won't spend a lot of time on the basics about this project, assuming that most people are somewhat familiar with it or have heard about it, but it just raises some questions for us around, you know, what's going to be the impact to the quality and the quantity of the water that's flowing out of those watersheds and through areas where First Nations continue to practice their treaty rights, as well as that intensification of land use in that very broad area. So we're trying to figure out right now who's going to assess what phase of this project. We don't necessarily know, except for phase 3, so the Capel South Water Conveyance Project that you see in green in the bottom right hand corner, we think will be assessed by the federal government. Phases 1 and 2 are in the top left hand corner, so those are like the light purple lavender phases, where Saskatchewan is saying, well, we did build most of the west side most of this west side project in, you know, the 1960s and 70s, so there aren't really any new impacts to talk about. And with respect to the larger, like darker lavender area, the west side expansion project, we are anticipating the province to conduct its own environmental assessment of that project. So all of those things have yet to be decided. It's just what the province's plans are that we understand from what it is submitted to the Impact Assessment Agency. And certainly our preference would be for federal environmental assessment of the entire, all 3 phases of the project, just because there are some more robust mechanisms in there for looking at things like cumulative effects that we think are a big issue when you're contemplating, you know, a project that has been described as generational and that is standing to directly impact 500,000 acres of land. So this summer we did see a designation request come out of Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. So they're a provincial advocacy organization that works to raise awareness around issues affecting First Nations in this province. And a designation request is just where they say, hey, to the federal minister of the environment, listen, we understand that you aren't planning on assessing phases 1 and 2 of this project right now. We know that you have the discretion to do so, and we would like you to exercise that discretion to make sure that they do undergo federal impact assessment. We supported that request with a letter of our own in July, and in November we heard from Canada that the minister was saying, no, I don't think I have enough information right now to make a decision about this, and he seems to have kind of said no for now. So we know that Canada is going to revisit its decision in January, because on those two, the first two phases of the project in purple, Saskatchewan is expecting to be delivering its technical proposals to the provincial environmental assessment branch and to the federal impact assessment agency. So Canada at that time will have more information and can maybe make a better informed decision about what it wants to do. Certainly we'll be following up with our own opinion of you know, what the minister should do about it, which is assess it federally. And we're just thinking about a lot of the issues that this project raises right now and how best to put those in front of Canada. So that concludes my the material that I've prepared, and I would be happy to open it up to discussion from the audience.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dana. That is a very informative presentation, and I know that you've touched on a lot of different things, from treaty rights, traditional land uses, the difference between, you know, duty to consult, and even, you know, how does an environmental assessment play into that. Yeah, I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure folks on the call have as well. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. So just a reminder for people, if you want to type in a question, you can do that in the question box, or you can also raise your hand. So feel free to send in your questions. All right, so we have one question here, and it kind of plays into, you know, consultation and private lands. So this is specifically with regards to agricultural drainage, and asking if the province has done consultations for the agriculture water management strategy. And the person here is just wondering if the province has consulted on the policy, even though it applies almost exclusively on private land. And if you're not familiar with that specific policy, there might be other examples of just, you know, how does that process work in terms of doing consultation on a policy that would apply to private lands, but might have implications for treaty rights.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't heard of, was it the agricultural water drainage strategy?
Agricultural water management strategy.
Yeah, I should look up what that is, because I have never heard of it. So nobody that, you know, I haven't seen the province consult on it, so, you know, it would definitely be interesting to me to look that up. The province does take a position with respect to private land in the consultation policy framework, and basically the position is they wouldn't normally consult on private projects taking place on private land unless those projects stood to have an effect on land to which First Nations have a right of use and occupation, or however they phrase it. So they wouldn't normally consider private land as anything taking place on private land as giving rise to an impact that they would have to consult on. But I guess we do take a little bit of a different position on that. I mean, first of all, the environmental effects are kind of that escape projects happening on private land and affect lands around them is one aspect that the province does kind of acknowledge that, and you have to be able to show it. But I think that there is also a good argument to be made around the fact that listen, private land isn't necessarily completely inaccessible to First Nations hunters, for example. And the Court of Appeal in the province also recently upheld case law to that effect, where, you know, if the land hasn't been put to a visible and incompatible use, then it is still possible to exercise your treaty right to hunt on it. So, you know, that doesn't really give the province license to kind of wave a magic wand and say, well, if it's happening on private land, then there can't be any impacts. There's also that to consider. And then just with respect to cumulative effects of, okay, well, if all the lands are now private and nobody can exercise treaty rights anywhere, then we've got like a cumulative impacts issue on our hands that we should be having conversations about.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And someone had kind of offered a follow-up question to that as well, which kind of ties into the provincial. You had shared briefly about the provincial's policy for consultation, and so this person was asking if the province is required to consult on new policies and strategies. Again, specifically for a wetland policy was the framework of their question, but if you want to kind of offer just your thoughts on elaborating a little bit more on the provincial side of things in terms of their requirement for consultation.
Yeah, so as a follow-up question, kind of whether the province would be required to consult on something like the wetlands policy that it's developing. Well, in our view, the answer would definitely be yes, to the extent that the wetlands policy has the potential to impact treaty and inherent rights, which I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is that wetlands absolutely do have you know, a critical role to play in the health of the lands and resources that First Nations rely on to be able to continue to exercise their treaty and inherent rights. So should the province be consulting on it? I would think so. The question is always, you know, who will have capacity to be able to respond and participate?
It's a good question, right? It's the hard limitations of the capacity, right? Which is, it's a hard reality. I think that you've really laid out the difference between the theory and in practice, what happens, right? Yeah. So there's a couple more follow-up questions again on water. So let me see here. One person was asking specifically about if you're familiar. I know that you've mentioned on the call already that your projects kind of keep you more in Treaty 4 area, as well as some work in Treaty 6. They're wondering if you have any comments about what's happening in the proposed development of peatlands along the forest fringe, especially around the Prince Albert Larange corridor. So if you're familiar with that, if you'd offer a comment. Yeah,
we did hear about that, and I had a really hard time figuring out what stage that project was at. If that, you know, that's definitely a conversation that we're interested in having. So if the person wants to reach out through you, Lindsay, and talk further about that, or if they have knowledge about it, or if that's a project they're currently working on. When we looked at it, as I say, I couldn't figure out what stage the project was at. I know that like a proposal had been made for a number of blocks. I want to say almost like maybe around 10 blocks of peat moss harvesting. And personally, I think we felt like that was pretty problematic at the time. And as much as in light of climate change, it just seems like the opposite direction that we want to be heading in. So the environmental effects do seem to be quite negative and drastic. And the other thing is, it's absolutely problematic for First Nations in the North, because those are the lands that they rely on to be able to go out and practice their rights. So I think a really robust consultation process would have to happen if that was to be the case. And my understanding is that that proposal really got hung up on the outcry over those proposals.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, and you made a very interesting comment, I think, about the environmental, like the interplay between treaty rights and the environmental assessment process, and how at times, you know, it's almost as if your comment was almost as if treaty rights sometimes kind of get filed under, okay, well, we'll do consultations under the environmental assessment. However, you said that there's also treaty rights that need to be considered that don't always, it's not that they fall under the environmental assessment, but that there's more treaty rights that would not necessarily be included in that. And so
Yeah.
I think, so our next question here, I think kind of gets to that comment and to that interplay about the environmental assessment. And the person more broadly just asked if First Nations would have an opportunity to ask for specific criteria regarding environmental assessments. So I don't know if you want to maybe just expand on that interplay, and maybe even if you'd want to comment on what you see could be what would need to happen to really have a more robust inclusion of all treaty rights and not just those that would be tied specifically to environment.
Yeah, I think so. So at the beginning of the assessment process, there should be a period where First Nations have an opportunity to identify their concerns and translate those concerns into value components or issues that will be examined through the environmental assessment process. So yeah, absolutely. I think that it is incumbent on Indigenous groups to think about the ways that their rights could be potentially impacted and translate that into issues that need to be examined during the environmental assessment process.
Thank you. Yeah. So our next question here is about the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation projects, which you touched on during your presentation. And they're just wondering if you can comment on the consultations for the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project, its designation, First Nation owning, the First Nation owning fee is, sorry, I'm just reading this out loud as I go. Yeah, if the person who asked this question wants to maybe just clarify here, but I'll read it as they've written it. So please provide comment on the consultation of the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project, the designation, and First Nations owning fee simple, also known as private lands in close proximity to the waterways within the phase, and that they use for agricultural purposes.
Oh, I think the question is like, what happens if a First Nation owns land? In fee simple just means the same way that most people own land. It's in Canada. So as opposed to it having the special status that you would have, the special protected status that you would have if it was converted to reserve land, it's simply land held by an entity that happens to be a First Nation, and they seem to be using it for farming purposes. I think with that, like, you always have to be able to show impacts to treaty and inherent rights. So if you're using that land for agriculture, fine, but what are the impacts to treaty and inherent rights that are giving rise to the duty to consult? So, is membership using that land to harvest medicines or things like that, maybe in the margins of the land, or I'm not sure what, but you always have to be able to show that impact to the rights in order to trigger the duty to consult. And that's what you'd need to look at, I think, for that piece of land.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that ties nicely, I think, with our next question, which has to do with the duty to consult. And if you have any suggestions for non-Indigenous landowners and managers to help facilitate the duty to consult, do you have any thoughts on that?
Good question. I'm not sure. I think that one of the things that we have benefited from, in our short time at this organization is collaboration between groups that have an interest in the same issues and that can share information and perspectives on that issue. So you know, as non-Indigenous landowners, you may be coming at it from a very different like legal standpoint and even just like lens of looking at the problem. But I think that there are, you know, benefits to be gained there from just sharing information and perspectives. So that's something that I have relied on to a certain extent is, you know, in all the conversations that I've had, even with, you know, members of, for example, the environmental movement or people who are more interested in the environmental issues, is they're always able to bring up stuff that I just hadn't thought of yet. So I think that's maybe where there are some advantages to be gained.
Yeah. So building those relationships and sharing the information together.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. And someone else is asking, you know, in terms of the point that you made about the selling of Crown lands, you know, someone was asking, how can we support the need for the consultation on this issue as we've seen the trend of selling Crown lands increase? Any thoughts to offer there?
I think just like you would notify your government of any issue, you know, how you would raise awareness or notify your government of any issue that you that matters to you. You know, if you're writing letters or if you're raising awareness among other similarly minded folks, that kind of thing, I guess, could be something good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. All right, so we have a few longer questions here. All right, sorry, there's questions and commentary. Someone had wanted to maybe follow up on the nuclear. You had talked about the the nuclear, and so the question here is that the Saskatchewan government is supporting the use of small nuclear reactors in isolated northern communities, you know, in order to reduce emissions from diesel generators in producing electricity. So it seems that because these reactors are small, and they put that in quotation marks, that they do not require an environmental assessment. So how is your organization maybe involved in the safety of nuclear reactors and the ongoing issue? Sorry, they're kind of pointing the two things. So you know, the safety issues, the concerns over safety, and then the concerns over storage of radioactive waste. But I think ultimately the question is, you know, how is your organization involved in this conversation with the small nuclear reactors?
Sure. So I think that the federal government is going to be involved in reviewing small modular reactors. So those are any nuclear reactor that produces 300 megawatts or less of power. My understanding is that both Impact Assessment Agency and Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will have a role to play in the assessment of those reactors. I was just gonna look up what I think that it's quite small. I think it's less than maybe 200 megawatts or something that they wouldn't be looking at. And then there would be like a provincial threshold for when the province has to look at it. But in any event, so we understand that both Impact Assessment Agency and Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission would be involved in the review of most of those nuclear reactors. Except for like very small ones, like micro ones, I think are less than 15 megawatts in any event. So there'll be environmental assessment to that extent. We are keeping tabs on the development of nuclear reactors. We understand that there is a test model by General Electric going forward in Ontario shortly, and that Saskatchewan is hoping to follow Ontario's lead by 2032, I believe. It made an important decision this fall about, or it was supposed to, about feasibility, and if it was feasible to advance this technology, then they were going to start pre-planning with a target date of, I think, 2032 for the first modular nuclear reactor in Saskatchewan. So, you know, we do try to take the perspective that we aren't wholesale opposed to development, but that we very strongly urge, you know, that we require responsible review and environmental assessment and the fulfillment of the duty to consult on development. Nuclear is a pretty touchy subject, and I think that it will take a lot of work for people to get comfortable with it. And I guess that's just one of our other projects that we are keeping track of the development on, and that we are thinking about. The last note I'll make about it is earlier in the presentation, I was talking about project specific versus strategic decisions. So I think we are thinking about nuclear from the point of view of, when does this become a strategic decision that triggers the duty to consult? And that's why we're watching the development of it.
Wonderful,
So
wonderful.
I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, but it was a lot of talking.
You've offered commentary on it, and I'm also conscious, you know, you have mentioned just the barriers and the limitations usually being around capacity, and just hearing you talk today, there's a lot of different issues happening and lots of different things which require lots of different areas of expertise, and so yeah, there's a lot happening for sure. We have a couple more questions with regards to, I think, the wetland and water conversation that we were having earlier. So I'd just like to loop back to that. One person here has provided a comment just saying that wetlands are critical wildlife habitat, and that First Nations, First Nations utilize wetlands and appreciate them and know this, and they're talking about the removal of wetlands, you know, diminishing the traditional land use opportunities, so hunting, otherwise, I guess the social value as well as the ecological value of wetlands.
Yeah.
And so they're talking about how, you know, if there should be duty to consult by the province when implementing drainage regulation. And there's a further, a second question following that, which is that because water belongs to the Crown, would drainage not also then require duty to consult? So yeah, would you have any comments on that with regards to drainage and water and the duty to consult there?
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of always goes back to the same thing. I mean, if removal of wetlands results in the removal of traditional land use opportunities, then it sounds like there's a potential impact to treaty and inherent rights there, which is exactly what gives rise to the duty to consult. I think that maybe an underused provision of that consultation policy framework is that Saskatchewan will consult on legislation that has the potential to affect treaty and inherent rights. That's something that even the case law hasn't given us. So, you know, maybe we need to start writing that into the letters and saying, hey, there's this policy and we would like to talk to you about it.
And I think, so the follow-up question about water, how it belongs to the Crown, I believe this question comes back to something that you talked about, right, with the treaties essentially being between First Nations and Canada, but then you had also talked about how Saskatchewan is looped in because, you know, regarding natural resources. And so do you want to maybe comment specifically on how that interplay happens, or you know, if you want to provide more comments on that relationship, how treaties are between First Nations and the Crown, but then how the province fits into that as well. And you know, this question is specifically around water. What do you do with water when the province is in charge of the drainage policy, but then there's also, you know, certain things that fall under Canada's legislation, and how does that all fit in with the duty to consult with First Nations?
Well, I'm not sure if this will be a good answer to the question, but I guess it's the same answer as before, which is that if there's an impact, then you just chase down who's responsible for that impact. I think water is difficult because I don't think it's easy to identify who's responsible for it. Canada has certain responsibilities in some respects, and so does the province. And then there's a whole regime of riparian rights holders that, to be honest, I'm not super familiar with, because that hasn't been something that I've had to focus on yet. So then there's a certain amount of ownership of whoever is on the edge of that water bed, right, or the riverbed or whatever, what have you. Anyways, in any event, it just comes back to what's the impact, who's responsible for it. I guess the note of earlier that I did mention was that, you know, the treaties were entered into with the British Crown, and the provinces became part of that arrangement by virtue of the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, where lands and resources were transferred to the provinces. So they do have responsibilities now, because if they're the ones managing and enjoying the benefits of those lands and resources, then they need to be talking to the people whose treaty and inherent rights they stand to impact in so doing.
Thank you, Dana. Well, yeah, it's a great conversation, and it's great to hear your thoughts on it. I am just mindful of the time, so we do have more questions. It is just a few minutes past 11 o'clock. Do you have a few more minutes to kind of chat through some last questions here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for the time, and folks on the call, I hope you can linger around and hear some more about just what Dana has to share here. So there is one question. This conversation will kind of bounce a little bit all over the place, but there is one question about funding. So the question is about, you know, is there funding from each government to provide capacity for consultation? So just wondering, yeah, does that funding come from Canada, from the province?
None of the above. Just kidding.
Okay.
It is definitely a struggle for us. So I touched on this briefly in the presentation, but the funding differs province to province. So for example, in Alberta, you used to have the province providing IRCs, GIRs, lands and resources offices with anywhere in the range of $250,000 to $400,000 a year to do this work. And that sounds like a lot of money, but it isn't. Because when you're talking about a lands and resources office like Mikisew Cree, where you have 15 people on staff, and you know that kind of funding gets gone through faster than you could imagine. But so that's the situation in Alberta. My understanding is that the new government in Alberta has reduced the operational funding to $100,000 a year across the board to every consultation office. But that's, you know, the difference between operational funding and then project specific funding. So at least with $100,000, you have the funding to kind of keep the lights on and have somebody or a couple of people there and maybe get a couple of things done. The difficulty is within Saskatchewan, where you don't have that at all, like nothing. The entire budget for consultation in this province in a year is $200,000 with 74 First Nations on all the projects that go forward. Now, I'm told that Saskatchewan regularly exceeds that budget, but it means that what you're dealing with is grants of $10,000. That's how they portion it out. Is the max you can apply for is $10,000, and that's only when if a project comes along that's Saskatchewan, based again on no traditional land use evidence and a proximity analysis, from what we can tell, decides that there's a potential for impacts. So that's the funding regime here is basically project-specific funding only if you meet a certain level of consultation, you know, that's decided by the province. So the difficulty with that is that then you're kind of like leaping from project to project and you don't get the full $10,000. You might get 8 or I don't know what. And you don't have that ability to build capacity in between, right? Like all the research or the letter writing or any of the stuff that I'm doing on Diefenbaker, for example, right now, there's no funding in place for that because Saskatchewan's environmental assessment process hasn't started and neither has the federal process, and we don't have any operational funding. So then First Nations are in the position, and any Indigenous group would be in the position of funding it yourself. So we do have access to some grants and, whatever funding here and there. So we apply, for example, one source of funding that we're hopeful about is that Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has recognized that, hey, project-specific funding doesn't make for a sustainable business model. It doesn't provide real meaningful capacity to consultation offices that are trying to do this work and build internal capacity in the long run. So they've created something called the Indigenous Capacity Support Program, where you can apply and for a chance to win the funding that you need to do the stuff you need to do in between project specific funding. So that's an example of it. We've also applied to, like cumulative effects funding programs or whatever sounds like it might fit. Climate change studies, things like that. So it is really difficult to get the work funded sustainably. I'm sure that maybe it's like that in other areas too, but yeah, that is definitely a difficulty here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for those comments. Yeah, our next question here is about the Treaty Land Sharing Network. And the question is specifically about if the Treaty Land Sharing Network help support or demonstrate a broader level of shared land use that could increase the need for duty to consult applicability. So if you have any thoughts or comments on what the Treaty Land Sharing Network is, maybe just for folks who aren't familiar with it on the call, and how that connects with the duty to consult.
Yeah, I understand the Treaty Land Sharing Network is a group of Saskatchewan residents who got together and wanted to offer, harvesters and rights bearers an opportunity to, a safe opportunity to hunt, gather, practice all of their rights on their land that they own. So they're a farm or what have you, and they've created a system where they'll put up a sign saying, hey, you're allowed to be here and come and practice your rights. And they're, I think one of the requirements is that it's kind of like you're all in. So it's not like there's only certain stuff that you can do, you can practice the full range of rights on that land once the sign is up. And I think that's great. I wish that it wasn't necessary. Like, I wish that citizens weren't in the position of having to come up with solutions for themselves, because we aren't seeing leadership on that at a higher level. But I also do think that it's a positive initiative, and I think it's to be commended. I feel like there's a second part to that question that I might have missed. Or does that answer it?
Yeah, I think the second part of the question was how that maybe demonstrates a broader level of support for the duty to consult applicability, which this might tie back to some of our earlier conversations about consultations and duty to consult on private lands and stuff like that. So any more thoughts? Yeah,
I guess you could say that it is related to the implementation of treaties. I mean, it's about sharing the land, right? So that's almost like, it's almost like aside from or before the duty to consult. Like, it's just a good way of sharing land, and and sharing the opportunities that the land affords us.
Wonderful. And this ties in, one question that we had received earlier was about consultations on how the province had developed and passed its new trespass legislation. So this is kind of the other side of the medal with the trespassing legislation. And yeah, so I don't know if you have any comments on, if there was any consultations prior to the province developing this legislation. And they've also compared the consultation with SARM, S-A-R-M.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what consultation, so that kind of predated my time in Saskatchewan. I don't know what the consultation was like on the Trespass to Property Act.
Okay, all right. Thank you. All right, okay, so let me just look here. So we have another question here about resource transfer agreements. And
Right.
if the resource transfer agreement states that the responsibilities transfer to the province. So the question in and of itself is, does the resource transfer agreement say that the responsibilities transfer to the province? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if the responsibility they're talking about is for management of lands and resources, or if it's for fulfillment of treaty. So the NRTA, now it's been a while since I've looked at the treaty land entitlement responsibility under the NRTA, but I think what it did was it created a little bit of a triangle, because the responsibility for fulfilling reserve land entitlement was on Canada, but the province was required to provide from time to time the land necessary for Canada to fulfill its responsibility under treaty to provide reserve land. So it created a little bit of a triangle where Saskatchewan had to provide the land to Canada so that Canada could fulfill its obligation. And both of those obligations, if I'm remembering correctly, are constitutional because the NRTA was incorporated in the Constitution. So that is a pretty high level obligation on the province.
Okay, wonderful. And I just see the person who asked the question followed up and said fulfillment of treaties. So I think, yeah, wonderful. We do have.
I have one last note I can add on that, which is that Blueberry River case also did say something about how the province has a fiduciary obligation with respect to treaties. So the province does have a fiduciary obligation to protect treaty rights from infringement, right? And that's why they were looking at the whole regulatory scheme. So there is also that additional responsibility on the provinces to, it does have a responsibility with respect to fulfillment of treaty.
Mm-hmm. And that Blueberry First Nations case, I mean, I think that's very interesting case, and cumulative effects, I think that will bring about a very interesting dialogue about, treaty rights, cumulative effects, environmental impacts, and that kind of feeds into another question that we've received about climate change, how it's changing the entire water cycle, the ecosystem functions. It really does have a broad-based impact, and ultimately how climate change will impact treaty rights. And this person was kind of asking if you think that there's any potential to propose a duty to consult about strategic decisions for phasing out fossil fuels, and kind of, I guess, in the broader scope, as we're seeing, cumulative impacts and these, I think, larger impacts to treaty rights, if that duty to consult would apply to things like phasing out fossil fuels and climate change. Any thoughts on that? Do you think we're there yet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it comes back to the answer, and I'm sorry to be a broken record, but you would have to be able to demonstrate the impact to treaty and inherent rights. And what I'm thinking in my head is, that would be a big, that would be a big task. I guess I can't help but think about it in a strategic way, which is, do we do that, or do we do something that's a little bit more concrete and manageable? But certainly, I mean, Blueberry River is a good example of something that was not a bite-sized piece of action. So how do you balance that? I mean, it's a good question. It's just, show me the impacts, show me the potential impacts.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so someone else wanted to loop back to the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project. And so, you know, in the Federal Department for Indigenous and Northern Affairs, so they're asking, is the Federal Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs on side with Indigenous concerns and the need for consultations, you know, along with the Indigenous community? So I don't know if you want to provide a comment on that relationship and potential allyship, and would they play at all a role that could influence the decision, or would I guess, you know, is it INAC now again? Would INAC play a role in that environmental assessment? And would there be any connections between INAC and the Environmental and Climate Change Canada? Yeah, any thoughts on that?
So when the agency is making a decision, for example, the designation request that happened this summer with respect to Diefenbaker, it has to do a little poll of the other, I think they're called responsible authorities or something like that. And basically what they have to do is they have to go around and ask other departments in the federal government what they think the, you know, effects on areas of federal jurisdiction could be. So like they did ask, I think it was ISC though. So INAC is now Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services Canada. I believe I saw a response from ISC in there to the effect that treaty and inherent rights do stand to be affected. I think the question that the agency is struggling with right now is, does Saskatchewan have means to address that? So they did comment. I don't know how persuasive or how, you know, do those comments go to the front of the pack? How much impact do they have? But they did comment.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, we have another question, I think, which draws back to, you know, what is meaningful consultation, which you've commented on that, how all consultation has to be meaningful. The consultation itself can maybe look different in different circumstances, but, you know, meaningful consultation is where we land on it. So any thoughts on, you know, and this person I think is kind of getting to, you know, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how well the provincial government is doing in incorporating, you know, feedback in policy decisions and strategic decisions, and in context of that broader conversation of what is meaningful consultation. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's meaningful? It depends. That's what they always tell you in law school. It depends. It's a combination of factors. So it's like, I don't think any one factor is necessarily determinative one way or the other, but there's a lot of things that the court will look at. Funding is one thing. The court will look at whether funding was provided. But it can go both ways. No funding, well, makes it a little harder. They better have had some meaningful ass other, you know, processes in there. So that's one factor. Another factor would be, were you speaking to a decision maker? Or were you just speaking to somebody who wrote down all your comments and walked away with them and never got back to you about them? You know, was accommodation ever on the table? Like, did they try to, you know, mitigation or accommodation, like, did they try to change the project, or did they explain why they couldn't change the project so as not to impact rights? I'm trying to think of some other ones. Was it a dialogue or was it a one-way? How much notice did you get? Did you get an information dump 24 hours before you're supposed to respond? Was it if you so the, you know, the control over what the process looks like isn't necessarily in Indigenous people's hands, but if they do go ahead and say, hey, we have these certain means of communicating that are very meaningful to us and we would like you to comply with, if they advance a consultation protocol or anything like that, you know, was it incorporated into the way that the consultation rolled out? So I think there's a lot of different factors that could contribute to what's meaningful or not.
And you've talked a lot about this two-way street, right? And so, yeah, there's a bit of a follow-up from the person who's asked the question in terms of, you know, how, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on how well the government is doing on regarding consultations as this two-way street, as the dialogue between sovereign entities. I don't know if you have any thoughts on comments on where we're at with that.
That's a good question. I think we would like to see, everyone says they'd like to see consultation happen sooner, but I don't know. It's hard to comment. I guess I wouldn't have a job if it was going really well. It was. I think that they. I think that there does need to be a little bit more of a stronger duty to consult in this province, for sure. I don't think that the way that the policy is being practiced is to the satisfaction of almost anybody at this point. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Okay, yeah. Well, you have a big mission ahead of you to work yourself out of a job. I like how you had put that earlier on, for sure.
Yeah.
So we just have a few last questions here. And one of them is, you know, FSIN. So for folks on the call who aren't familiar with FSIN, that's the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan. And so the question is, you know, what's the relationship between FSIN and IRC's Indigenous Relations Councils? And does the FSIN have their own IRC that would cover the whole province? Any thoughts or comments on that?
So, yeah, FSIN has a Lands and Resource Commission where they look at issues affecting lands and resources that may be of interest to First Nations. FSIN doesn't have, like, isn't a rights bearer in itself, but it interfaces very closely with them and, you know, is a source of information and advocacy for them. But yeah, that's it. I'm not aware of very many IRCs in this province, so that's something that is a little bit different from Alberta, where First Nations in this province don't necessarily often have a Lands and Resources Office that's dedicated specifically to Crown Consultation. Yeah, it's just not as prominent here, and there just isn't, like I say, that those resources behind it here. There are a few exceptions, of course, but just not by and large.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. Well, we have a few last questions that I've kept till the end because I think it's a really good place to land. You know, so one person has asked here, you know, do you believe First Nations are interested in changing not only the, you know, consultation, but the actual processes inside the provincial political system? So do you find that there's an interest or a hunger for political activism?
Sorry, and you mean like among First Nations, or?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, I mean, they're constantly engaged in political advocacy for their membership, constantly. And it's like, yeah, they have to work very hard to obtain the services and the infrastructure that most of us take for granted. So there is a lot of advocacy that goes on all the time.
Wonderful. And there's a few last comments here. So one person is really asking about, how can we be more engaged in building those relationships? So specifically, I think within the realm of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. And, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on what it could look like to build coalitions and strengthening those, information sharing in those relationships, whether it be between organizations or individuals, around common concerns and goals. And if you have any thoughts on whether that would go further, than some of, I guess just in terms of coming together on that. So yeah, any thoughts about, building those relationships and building that strength in information sharing?
I think it's, I don't know if I can comment on that. I think what I would like to say about it is just to be aware, just be very respectful of the people that you're reaching out to, because just because you feel that you have a common goal with them doesn't always necessarily mean that they are going to respond in a way that you might expect. And that might be due to, like I say, the capacity issues where it's there's just so many other priorities and so many other fires to put out and things like that, that it's really can be hard to dedicate the time and attention to each one of these issues that they deserve. So I think it would just be a matter of any reaching out that you do to do so in a really respectful manner, in a way also that, their protocols and processes might be different and need to be respected as well. So I'm sorry that I can't be very helpful on that issue, and I wish I could, and I'm sure it's something that I'll take away and try to think of a better answer for next time.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think this person was, commenting on, the selling of Crown lands, which we had a talk earlier this week about the selling of Crown lands, and then concerns over wetland losses and water issues in the Lake Diefenbaker. And so, just wondering, in those conversations even that we've had this week on environmental issues, if there's opportunities, to, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts, even like how would someone would want to get started if they wanted to come together with Indigenous people and maybe learn and maybe learn more about how these environmental issues, impact treaty rights and how they can be mindful of that in their advocacy. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, one of my conversations that I had a few months back was really opened my eyes a little bit. It was with somebody who had been with an environmental group for a number of years and said, we've really changed our approach. And, we used to sometimes join up with First Nations, hoping that they would support our issue. And, we've changed our approach where we try to look for ways that we can support their issues. And I think that's really probably the best advice that I can give. So so then once you've, identified an issue that you think you could help them support them on.
Wonderful. Build a relationship. It's,
yeah,
really, I think what it comes down to, right? And yeah, wonderful. And so I just want to land on this. So folks were just wondering if you could share those resources again. You had shared a few resources.
Oh, yeah.
And I would maybe even extend that, any, yeah, any suggestions for folks to maybe learn more, how to get started, any groups they could reach out to if they wanted to learn more about these topics. So, the resources, but then if you have any broader comments about, who can they talk to, who's doing this type of work. I'll just open it up.
I'll try to show my screen again. Like I'll try to show so that you can see. These are just a couple of books that I thought were very, well, Loyal Till Death is pertinent to the Saskatchewan example, and Clearing the Plains is as well. So those are both pretty eye-opening, I would say, around like the history of this region and also the government policy and the way the plains were settled. I'm actually doing this Indigenous Canada course through Coursera right now. It kind of got a bunch of attention because one of the actors from Schitt's Creek signed up for it and advertised it online a little bit. But I have found that Indigenous Canada course to be fairly like broad, and I found it to be consistent with what my understanding is through the work that I do. So those are 3 sources that I could recommend getting started with. The other thing is maybe the Office of the Treaty Commissioner maybe would be able to do, because I know they do a lot of work around reconciliation. I know they have a project going right now about marking the edge of treaties on highways. I think that's their work. So that might be another source. And yeah, those would be some good places to get started.
Wonderful. And an audience member also submitted a resource as well that I'll share with you all. So he had recommended No Surrender, The Land Remains Indigenous by Sheldon Krasowski. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right. So that's another resource that you guys can check out as well. No Surrender, The Land Remains Indigenous. Wonderful. Well, Dana, thank you so much for staying later. Thank you for everyone else who's stayed until the very end. I think I speak for everyone in saying that this has been very informative, and yeah, thanks for just sharing your expertise, for sharing your experience, and you know, having this conversation with us today. It's really been wonderful. So
yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for all their good questions. Put me on the spot.
That's right. That's right. Lots of great questions here. So I just want to take a few moments here and just recognize our partners. So of course, Citizens Environmental Alliance has hosted this conference along with many partners such as the Calling Lakes Eco Museum, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Eco-Friendly Saskatchewan, Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, the Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, Nature Saskatchewan, Parks, Public Pastures, Public Interest, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, the CR Club Canada Foundation, the Saskatchewan Alliance for Water Sustainability, and the Saskatoon Wildlife Federation. So just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, and thank you everyone for joining us during our 3rd annual Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. If you want to catch this presentation again, if you want to, you know, do it a second round, or if you've missed any sessions, all the sessions will be available. All the recorded sessions will be available on the Citizens Environmental Alliance YouTube page. So please do go check that out. There's past sessions from previous years as well on that page. And stay tuned for more. We want to continue these discussions and the work that we're doing here. So we'll have some more webinars coming your way in February. So thanks again for joining us. Dana, wonderful to have you. It's really great work that you're doing, and I'm glad that you could come and share with us today. So with that, thanks again, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, everybody.